Hi guys, we really enjoyed reading The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson, and we hope that after watching this, you will want to read it too.
The author's purpose was to inform his audience about what had happened at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He included the process of how the fair was constructed, but he also gave insight to sick understory of Henry Holmes. Furthermore, Larson depicted the architects' lives and the problems they faced regarding the organization of the fair. By doing so, the author was able to vividly portray the evils of human nature both through displays of ego and murder. His purpose was to show that the world was so blinded by the extravagance of the fair, they paid no attention to the serial killings that were happening just blocks away from the fair's grounds. Thus, he was able to give a real-world example of how there are always two sides to a story.
Following the construction of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, America sought to prove itself as the superior nation by building a larger exposition. This exposition was to be presented as a world fair to commemorate the anniversary of Columbus. There was much debate on where to host this exposition, but Chicago was ultimately chosen as the city for the fair.
Woohoo!
Now to introduce the architects. This is Daniel Burnham, the most important architect. Burnham was given the position of lead director for the fair, and he appointed John Root, his best friend and business partner, as his right-hand man. The rest of these men are not as important. The architects were slow in their design process, and as soon as construction began, more problems surfaced. National economy was on the verge of tanking, materials did not come in on predicted dates, and there were union strikes for better pay and better work days. The fair was overall behind in their schedule. Then, halfway through the process, Root died, and this loss of Burnham's main partner was a huge setback. Along with this, the weather destroyed buildings and was constantly setting the construction team behind schedule.
What a surprise.
Shortly before opening day, set for May 1st, architects came across George Ferris, who had plans for a big rotating wheel which would later be known as the Ferris wheel. This attraction gathered a lot of attention from the public and helped gain anticipation for opening day.
Ooh, I'm so excited for that.
However, on opening day, many exhibits were still unfinished, including the main star, the Ferris wheel.
What a disappointment.
The unfinished fair spread a negative opinion about the fair as the architects desperately tried to raise attendance. Eventually, almost 2 months after opening, the Ferris wheel became open to the public, raising attendance and excitement. From then on, attendance rates rose and fell again many times before the fair's set closing date, October 30th. The closing ceremony held 750,000 people, becoming the most attended event in history at the time and beating Paris's exposition. Many new inventions were introduced at the fair, some of which you may recognize today, including the Cracker Jack, the electric chair, and spray paint. Despite this, the fair ended in tragedy as the mayor was assassinated the day before. Amongst all this, a doctor took advantage of the mass of people arriving for the fair. Meet H.H. Holmes. Upon first moving to Chicago, the soon-to-be serial killer took possession of a pharmacy under which he built a gas chamber and kiln. Here, he seduced women, married them, manipulated them out of their money, and got some pregnant. And then killed them. He had accumulated a lot of debt under various aliases and used his many murders to rob people of their life insurance. He still never paid his debt. As the opening of the fair approached, he devised a plan to build a large hotel near the site of the fair, which would later be known as Holmes' Murder Castle. Dun dun dun! This hotel contained many rooms along with a gas chamber, dissection table, and crematorium underneath. Here he committed an estimated 200 murders during the time of the fair. Because the city was so large and full of crime, disappearances were rarely noticed or investigated thoroughly. It wasn't until 2 to 3 years later he would begin to be suspected by a detective named Frank Geyer, after Holmes' business partner Benjamin Pitezel was found dead and his kids missing. Due to his immense charm and charisma, Holmes was able to avoid suspicion up until this point. Holmes was questioned and imprisoned for insurance fraud, while Geyer searched for Pitezel's children. After a long investigation, the kids' bodies were found dead, and Holmes was tried for their murder. Holmes was found guilty for the Pitezel family murders, but was never convicted for his murder castle. Dun dun dun!
In the early 19th century, Chicago was comprised of two drastically contrasting parts. The White City and the Black City distinctly represented the constant internal struggle of good and bad that is an inherent part of human life. Moreover, the fair, which was entirely painted white, provided hope for the people of Chicago during a time of financial difficulty. People during this time period were actively trying to better the quality of life through the fair. For example, the fair did more than simply stroke pride. It gave Chicago a light to hold against the gathering dark of economic calamity. Larson 288. Women were also leading the burbs to live and work in cities. New inventions like Edison's light bulb were bringing society into a newly modernized world, and labor unions were beginning to find voices through leaders like the Chicago's mayor, Carter Harrison. The fair also played a role in introducing inventions such as the Ferris wheel. While people were trying to increase Chicago's notability, Holmes was the inherent evil against the good of the city. Holmes and others were increasing civil crime rates. He was so immersed in his evil endeavors, he described himself as liking being near enough to hear the approach of death in the rising panic of his victims. This was when his quest for possession entered its most satisfying phase. Holmes' Tower of Murder was also dubbed the Black City because it was symbolized the evil that stopped prosperity throughout the community.
The second theme we found in this book was the theme of change and disillusionment. The Chicago World Fair was marked with many changes and innovations in architecture, gender roles, and entertainment. Attractions were being built at a scale larger than ever before, women were beginning to find work in cities, and inventions were pioneered that still remain today. The opening of the fair was marked with great promise and hope. However, the fair quickly lost momentum and was shadowed by crime and devastation in the city. During the early conception of the fair, Chicago was growing in all available directions. It was meant to be the greatest event of its time, and the people of Chicago anticipated it as such. It would portray Chicago as a beautiful, idyllic place, referred to as the White City. Despite all of this promise, though, the fair ended in disillusionment and quickly faded from people's minds. The fair's attendance plummeted after the first week, and crime, unemployment, and poverty began to take hold of the city. Larson writes that the White City had drawn men and protected them. The Black City now welcomed them back on the eve of winter with filth, starvation, and violence. The once esteemed White City had fallen to a dark place, and the promise of the fair was forgotten. The closing ceremony was tainted by the tragic death of the mayor. This time that began with hope and innovation ended with disillusionment due to the fact that the fair and the city did not bring the change that everyone anticipated it to.
In his personal memoir, Holmes employs the rhetorical technique of comparison by drawing parallels between his killings and a poet's singing. While its comparison is used to describe his innate attraction to murder, it also characterizes his romanticization of this crime. There is a clear contrast between the uplifting, hopeful tone implied by a poet's inspiration to create music and the insanity Holmes is comparing that to. By comparing himself to a poet, Holmes conveys that he's equivalent to someone who creates art or something of beauty. Though this is an attempt to rationalize his action, it is clear that he feels no remorse for the hundreds of murders he's committed and takes pride in what he's done. His mental instability that causes desire for blood leads him to view his crimes through rose-colored glasses and find a twisted beauty in the horrible things he's done. Furthermore, the language used by Larson in his description of Holmes alienates him from the other human characters in the novel in order to emphasize his lack of morality and empathy. He refers to Holmes as a far stranger creature in comparison to the architects in charge of the fair. Larson neglects to even write that Holmes is a man. Instead, he uses the word creature as a descriptor. This illustrates the clear difference between Holmes and the others. More sane men in the book, and serves to refute Holmes' justification of his crimes. By priming the reader with this image of an inhumane creature, Holmes' following claim that he is similar to a poet sounds even less rational. The language Larson uses in reciting Holmes' writing characterizes Holmes as an unstable and inhumane character and reiterates the insanity portrayed by Holmes in his memoir.